Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion on unlocking content modernization within your content strategy. Our presenters today are Greg Wilson, VP of Content Strategies at ASG Technologies, Ryan McVeigh, SVP and General Manager at Zia Consulting, and Dan Champ, National Sales Manager at Ephesoft. Our panel is going to run about 60 minutes, and if you have a question at any time, please type it into that chat window, and we'll respond during the session. We are recording today's event, and everyone will receive an email with the link to the recording and slides later today. Thanks again for joining us, and with that, I'll pass it to Greg.
Thanks so much, Emily. Hi, Dan. Hey, Ryan. Thanks for joining with me today. Before we get going, I'd just like to say hello to our audience, and before walking through the agenda, just say that Ryan, Dan, and myself really appreciate you being with us here today. We realize that the most valuable commodity that all of us have is our time, and we understand that every one of us on this call most likely has a lengthy list of to-do items and things that we could be focused on right now. So first off, we thank you for investing your time in this session and in the three of us, and we will do our best to make this fun and informative. Also, we hope that your friends and family are safe, healthy, and happy. These have certainly been unprecedented times with COVID, and we seem to be getting some steps further along, but I'm just thinking of all of you and hope that you're well. The other thing I would say for how we're structuring this event and how we're thinking about our session here today is Ryan and Dan and I thought back to a number of different evening events that we were hosting before COVID. And those events really evolved over time from more of a formal presentation into a less and less formal conversation. And it became abundantly clear that the more that we started to serve as facilitators, rather than just presenters, the more enjoyable, in-depth, and interesting these conversations became. So they certainly were lively discussions. We realized at times that could be much more difficult to pull off here in a virtual environment. But we do ask that for those in the line, we know that all of you bring a lot of interesting insights and personal experiences in the topics that we're going to cover here today. And we ask that you jump in and be a part of the conversation. You can feel free to just enter anything within chat. We'll keep an eye out for questions and items and input that come up on chat. You can help direct the conversations in certain ways with your questions or input, and we would love to hear from you. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and turn our eyes to the agenda. For starters, I will be just taking a minute or two and talking about recent trends that are impacting content services. And how we manage, access, and automate the work that we do around documents and records. And there is a lot going on in this space, and it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. So we thought a top list of maybe 3 broad themes was appropriate to set the stage. And then from there, we'll dive deeper into those within our discussion topics for today. Ryan, Dan, and myself have had time to sync up and discuss the types of modernization and transformation projects that we've been involved with, and the clients that we've worked with. And we've really come up with these 3 key themes for us to explore during our session here today around operational excellence, around automating compliance, and then also taking a look at cloud and modernization. And each one of these will have some discussion space that we'll spend some time on here today as well and dig into. So if we think about current trends within content modernization, myself and the other folks we have on the line here have been within this space. That's something that we're probably counting in decades rather than seasons or years. And it's been interesting, I guess, to just take a step back. If we think about modernization and transformation, these were really gaining momentum a few years back. And part of that was established companies found themselves fighting for market share with a new wave of companies that were cloud-born, that were very agile to change, that had much smaller IT costs and footprints. And they were really giving the establishment a run for their money on customer satisfaction by placing a huge focus and energy around raising that quality on the customer touch point that they had. And where we find ourselves today is those established companies, as well as a new wave of companies, are in a constant state of looking for how they're going to transform and modernize what they're doing to wow their customers, to drive down costs, to find more market share. And we kind of moved from that into the next wave that came about of this idea of promise of cloud and need to consolidate IT debt into consumer privacy with GDPR, CCPA, and now many others. And that really turned that focus of just thinking about customer touch points to overall just thinking about how we were managing and leveraging customer information and that need for compliance around that. And then not too far behind that, we get hit from behind with COVID, right? And all of a sudden there's this whole aspect of remote working that comes into play. And COVID has brought a lot of pressure to internal processes that really maybe hadn't been challenged or thought about or reviewed in years. And in a remote environment, all of a sudden these came to the forefront of work that we needed to do. Now, with these remote workers, communications, supply chains, and especially paper-based environments, we're really forced to adjust. The other thing that we've talked about and that we've seen with COVID too across our client base is just how organizations have really been forced into this need for automation, right? Many organizations have experienced reductions in IT staff and business staff, and needing to find ways to automate just to keep up with the workloads in the business that are out there is something that that's really been a focus. And I guess I kind of wiped the sweat off my brow a little bit for someone who's been in the industry for the number of years that I have. These last 3 to 4 years have just really seen significant changes, from cloud and transformation, through to COVID and consumer privacy. And as we think about those trends, some of the main themes that we're going to lay out here, and these will probably be familiar for the audience, but I think it's just good to set the stage. What comes up over and over again is this idea of repetitive and low value tasks, right? How do we take things that Gartner is kind of coining at this point of hyper applications, right? How do we get further down the path of bringing together workflow and things like robotic process automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence to just be smarter about what we're doing, and not just looking at, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 major workflow initiatives, but just thinking about those manual gaps that are really impacting end users each and every day that may have felt too small before, or too much work to automate all of a sudden is something with hyper apps and machine learning is really now available. Um, Certainly, as I'm sure with my co-presenters here as well as the audience, the idea of fragmented IT infrastructure, these thoughts about siloed systems and the impact that that's having on not being able to automate, of really holding us back from modernization. And we see those fragmented IT infrastructures now really being focused more so on how do we modernize around the cloud. The concern about compliance with redundant systems that we've had for years. Now we're moving into the stage of I'm really exposed by having 4 or 5 systems that do the same thing, or we've experienced 10 or 20 acquisitions and mergers over the last decade or more. And all these systems that we have are really now requiring that we bring this closer together and start to consolidate what we have out there. And that the effort and focus is worth the results that we can see from this on multiple fronts. And as I've mentioned, obviously COVID fits in here too. And third, and certainly something I don't want to overlook, and this will come across a number of these topics, is the idea of dormant documents and unstructured data and the need for organizations to become more data driven. And this certainly falls into that idea of wowing the customers and picking up more market share, but it also really leads into automation as well. And what I find very interesting is things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, being data driven are things we've been talking about for years. But what I'm really seeing and projects that we've taken on recently of really a step change in what's available today, and also going through a number of proof of concepts when it comes to digitization, workflow, and automation, and seeing the clients really excited and wowed by the technology that's out there now and the accuracy of what we're able to accomplish without human interaction. So I don't want to go further on those topics than that right now, because we'll certainly be delving into that during our discussion here today. But that really sets the stage for us. And from here, I'd like to delve into our first discussion topic. So with that in mind, Ryan, we'll first turn our sights over to cloud and modernization. And for the audience, when we think about modernization in this regard, I'm really thinking about it from an infrastructure perspective, as we talked about with IT debt, with redundant systems. And we see organizations that are in all different steps of their cloud maturity, right? Of either trying to move, maybe they're cloud first for new applications, maybe they have ERPs that are running in the cloud or certain line of business apps. but there's still a lot of legacy stuff that's sitting on mainframes or on-prem or in, private cloud as well. And really just trying to get their arms around that. And when we think about that, Ryan, you and I talk a lot about this idea of, retaining, retiring, replacing, and making those decisions and understanding up front maybe some of the, some of the work there and where to begin. So I think a good way to kind of warm into this conversation, if you will, Ryan, is let's talk about, within recent consolidation and cloud migration projects, how have these evolved for Zia Consulting over time? And what are some of those lessons learned that you take to those types of projects today that maybe weren't really muscle memory, let's say 2 to 3 years ago?
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. How have they evolved over time? That's a great question. It's hard not to contemplate the past year and a half or so with regards to just our environment, how we're working. We're doing this from home offices, for example. Those considerations are in the forefront as I might think about the time constraints to the question here. What I would tell you, though, is that evolution certainly has continued. We have had that dialogue throughout that time frame and certainly beforehand. So that's an at the forefront conversation for our business. Our customers, frankly, are the age-old comment, I think, is do more with less, right? The budget constraints are real. People are certainly trying to accomplish more, and often are faced with challenges in spending and their ability to do that. So it's very real for our customers and our mutual customers to simply just experience that challenge of this need to modernize, right? That seems obvious, but how do you do that effectively on a budget? Not that there wasn't a budget before, but it's certainly more constrained today than it once was. So that's a very real challenge. And you mentioned, and as we've discussed, like the retain, retire, replace, that's a very important conversation. And as you think about how you choose to spend money, you certainly need to focus on the biggest bang for your buck. And one of the things that, I'm going to keep this pretty high level here. One of the things we talk a lot about in our business is this concept of simply crawl, then walk, then run, right? You don't need to do a boil the ocean approach to achieve modernization goals or to achieve a cloud vision. You certainly can take a phased approach. A question was asked of us recently with regards to a migration project we're working on currently, and I think it was the CIO for this customer asked us directly, how do I work with my existing systems during this exercise, right? During this, in their case, a migration. And we talked with them through, in essence, keeping the users engaged with what they have, and in essence, obfuscating the fact that migration was occurring in the background. And that's a common strategy, but one that we continue to employ in what we're doing. Greg, perhaps one of the more obvious things to me that maybe isn't obvious to the audience is, and we'll see this with vendors like ASG that have had deployments for some time with customers, that they have product that works really well, and they're very happy with it. And as a result, sometimes I won't say that it gets forgotten. However, it doesn't perhaps get the attention it might be appropriate in a regular basis. Where I'm going is, upgrade, right? You might be a version or two back, or even 3, and sometimes that's the best answer, right? Don't necessarily concern yourself with a replacement, but think about what are the capabilities in the future. So for your Mobius folks on the line here, that's one worthy of consideration. It is certainly appropriate, of course, to think about where consolidation makes sense. So we see time and time again in our business, and I remind our customers constantly that you're not alone. And when you find that you have multiple, and when I say multiple, I mean over a dozen systems that do similar things in managing and retaining and housing content, that is a very normal experience. Sometimes it just is as simple as, picking a couple of those things and addressing them and working towards consolidation. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but I will say that I think gone is the overall industry goal of one content system to rule them all, right? That's typically no longer a reasonable target, and finding the purpose-built things appropriately, as well as honing in on the key areas that actually really support your business without necessarily going whole hog. So to wrap all of that up, I would say go back and carefully analyze what you have and what you can take advantage of. This is a normal conversation we've been having throughout, if not more focused today. There certainly is an appropriate conversation around retirement, and it might just mean, like you said, Greg, moving off the mainframe and going to distributed, or going to an in-house data center versus a cloud data center. And then certainly it may be appropriate to replace technology or make a new investment into something modern and move off of those older things or any of those things that are no longer perhaps available to you for additional research and development.
Yeah, really good points, Ryan. Yeah, and as I think about this question too, there always seems to be that bit of a balancing act from the idea of the quick win that might be needed, or getting something up in the cloud. But I think also, as we've learned over time, when I think back to some of the earlier cloud projects, we would be charging forward with one group and maybe a vision on the architect side of what they wanted. And then you get to the business side of the house and you start to understand the integration that's required for the processes and work they do. Or we get down the path with the architects and the business side of the house, and then the compliance team says, okay, hold on a second, this is how we're kind of viewing and interpreting these regulations and what we want to do. And I think one thing that we've gotten better at is not necessarily getting everybody to the same table at the same time, which I think is just can cause utter confusion, but better understanding that natural process of who to get involved when, to keep momentum with the project, to keep things moving forward, and to make sure we're checking those boxes that these things don't come to a screeching halt, right, for the overall consolidation and migration piece. And I also think too that I think we've also just gotten a little bit better on, it's great to think about, let's change our infrastructure altogether. But I think what we're seeing is a lot more nuance on that idea of retaining, retiring, and replacing, right? What are those key systems? How do we prioritize these systems of which are most important to us? But also, which are going to be the most work for us to get off of? What are these systems have been there a long time and brittle and might be better to sunset? And I think there's some things we've learned there. Ryan, one thing I think that might help within this conversation too is to just put up a quick use case and a couple of visuals too. So this is specific, what we're looking at here, to a project that we've worked on for a top 10 property and casualty insurance company, Fortune 100 US based. And the project that they really had was more of that, really jumping in with both feet of the goal of moving towards a zero footprint on-premise data center in 5 years. And as you can imagine, for an organization of this size, Fortune 100, this was a pretty big task. The target around this was looking at a 30% overall reduction in infrastructure costs. And there was an extensive vendor evaluation that took place here, right? So from a client really thinking about this, what we had heard from them was they really had every imaging and content management system that was under the sun, right? That had been probably created in the last 15 years. And how they really boiled this down of who they wanted to work with and how they wanted to move forward were based off of things like ingestion performance, retrieval performance, rasterization. How quickly can I take a document from its native format, convert it to PDF, and a very in-depth evaluation. But once we got through all of that, and the Mobius content platform that is ASG's platform, really shined across those different topics. But once we started really getting down into the project, what we saw, Ryan, to your point earlier, was let's start with a big business win, and let's start with phase one really being about federating against these different systems, right? So it actually encompassed about 10,000 end users. And it was over, I think 5 of these content services and imaging systems. So the first thing we did was built the integration there, gave that win to the end user. So now going across 5 different systems, they're logging into one common interface, and they're able to get to all that information. And from there, then we can start looking at handling the migration of those imaging systems, the content systems, Mobius, which was on-prem, over to the cloud, as well as dead applications. The other thing that this really set us up for is realizing by having Mobius running on-prem, in an instance of that, we didn't have to migrate everything immediately to the cloud. We could have a staging environment on-prem to handle that, and then migrate in the background. With Mobius, we're also able to pass archive documents between different operating platforms without reprocessing. So we can move from Windows and Linux or even ZOS on-prem out to AWS or Azure without needing to do that. So it really offered some flexibility for this client in that regard as well. And then if I hop to the next slide, you can see as we move into phase 2, now let's grow the scope of that project into also talking about, the debt applications that are out there, the line of business applications that may not be creating any new content or records or data, but there's still information that's being accessed there. And then also taking the rest of the departmental imaging solutions and legacy content that maybe we didn't federate against, but we know that we need to move, and getting those over to Mobius running in the cloud as well. And that's a high level, but I think what it does is it starts to paint that picture of business side of the house first, federation side of the house first, and then moving through this process. The one thing I would add to this, because this is a project that's been in motion for a while now, just because of the scope of it, is I also see advancements and things we'll talk about here in a little bit, just thinking about governance and compliance and how that starts to come into the fold around this as well. Ryan, I know you've also had involvement with this client and this account, so I'll pause and see if there were any other data points you'd like to add here.
Really, I think you've covered it totally, Greg. But actually, what I'm going to do is swing us back just a step here. We got a question while we were speaking, and I'd like to address it in line here. So, to summarize the question here, it was about business justification, right? Upgrading a system, for example, from on-premise to cloud, and what value is it to the business aside from just the software component. So that's a summarized version of what we got. But I think an important thing to think about there, certainly just simply upgrading from version X to Y is not a good reason typically. Usually you're obviously looking at, functional reasons, enhancements in the software and so on. Occasionally, right, vendors, of course, have a burden of support that's tied to you being on current or relatively current software, and you can't run things that are 5 years old because that's impossible to support. So there's the reality of that. But to answer the question that was asked, I would say from a business justification standpoint, alignment with current state of the industry is a big one, right? What is your vendor doing? We'll use ASG Mobius as an example, right? What has ASG done with Mobius to justify such a thing? One thing that attracted Zia and ASG to one another years ago when we partnered initially was the fact that the Mobius technology is cloud native. It was architected to be cloud native, and we were able to take advantage of the services that a provider such as AWS produces in the back end, and thus overall the investment in that infrastructure, and I use infrastructure broadly here, is going to be less than what it might be in an on-premise deployment. So organizations that are thinking cloud first got an obvious kind of bang for the buck by taking that step. So I realize that's a very specific example, and if your question isn't completely answered, please hit us up afterwards. We'll certainly follow up with you there. But Greg, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, I think there's certain things that, and I think about this from a Mobius content services perspective, with recent upgrades and leveraging the cloud, you do pick up things with Docker and Kubernetes, right? That could be handled through your organization or as a managed service that we work on with Zia. But there's certainly advantages of just being able to spin up prod and non-prod environments as needed, right? Much faster, much easier, more nimble in that regard. I also see a lot of the organizations that we work with, and specifically the example here, that there's always a concern of hardware and how much hardware do we really need and what is our peak season, and really having a lot of dormant hardware that kind of sits around waiting for that peak season, then hope that you guessed correctly, right? We work with many organizations and the financial services industry, and when it comes, tax season time, or retailers when it comes around holiday season, they see incredible spikes. And I guess to double click, Ryan, as you said about cloud native, having capabilities around that we can auto scale and bring other resources on as needed rather than trying to guess the amount of servers and CPUs certainly helps. I also think that there's things on the business side of the house that they get excited about when we think about these types of projects. First off, for just getting to a current version of our software, but also getting to current versions from other software that they've been running for quite a while that, maybe they're on the current versions or older versions, but there's features that seem to be maybe not present things like having redaction at time of retrieval, from a governance perspective, having event-based retention available, having very open, REST APIs. And Ryan, it goes to your point earlier of really this idea of headless content services as well, right? We're not really in the game of, and it's funny to say this as we talk about consolidation, but it's not really the game of putting everything in your enterprise inside of the Mobius repository. It's the middle layer that we bring to the game of how open it is and how you can integrate into multiple systems and how we can help serve as the piping between many different systems. Sometimes the information might reside in Mobius long-term, sometimes it may not. But I think we also see, Ryan, that uptick with federated redaction capabilities. So being able to redact information across disparate systems as well. So I think there's a lot of advantages kind of on different fronts here as we think about performance, as we think about flexibility, flexibility for just how this information is served up and how it's integrated in other systems as well. So excellent question. I hope that helped answer. If there's further questions around that, would be happy to do a follow-up there as well. And with that in mind, I'll pop down to our second question on cloud and modernization. And that is around any recent innovative technologies see impacting system modernization. So we started to touch on this a little bit, but Ryan, I'd like to start off with you on this one, and then I'll feel free to chime in as well. So go ahead.
Sure, of course. It's funny, Greg. I think a couple of years ago, when I was having this kind of a webinar or just a customer conversation, right, we would say I think the thing I would say a lot, we'd always have that diagram on the slide, was a picture of a cloud, right? You can't have a conversation without talking about the cloud, and certainly that is true. We don't need to say that now, but I do feel like we've arrived at the point in time where that's true about AI and ML. And we have to be able to have a conversation about that. And one of the things I love about our relationship with all of our vendors here is we're all thinking in that way and implementing in that way and taking advantage of those capabilities, both in our technologies and around us. And so, AI ML is perhaps another answer to the question that was asked earlier, right? In terms of capabilities and reason to migrate, but the things that the US software vendors are creating to enable intelligence in software deployments around your information is a big key one, and providing drive for modernization. Another area too, Greg, again, would be RPA. And sometimes we joke at Zia, if we had just said the word robot back in the day when we were doing this work, when it was kind of labeled something else, we'd be, well, you wouldn't be talking to me. I'd be on an island somewhere, right? But all kidding aside, RPA is very much relatively recent in terms of how the industry is speaking about it today, and really a big piece of what we're seeing our customers consider as they look at modernization efforts.
Yeah, I would, it's good thoughts there. And it's funny because I take this one a little bit of a different direction. That's why I like having these conversations. I think around system modernization is, as we look at consolidating systems that are out there today, what we generally find is they're very limited on the amount of indexes and metadata that they have, right? And because of that, when the documents were originally archived, there was probably some personal information that was recognized, social security number, maybe one or two other pieces, and then it was archived. And what we see today is with consumer privacy that really doesn't match up to what is really needed from a redaction perspective. So when I think about system modernization, I think about recent work that we've done, Ryan, on actually integrating discovery tools into this overall solution. So we can actually comb through documents and records that are already inside of Mobius or outside of Mobius on shared drives or other systems, identify that sensitive information, make sure that if there is customer information there, that it's redacted properly, and then also make sure that the retention schedules match up to that and that document is actually aligned and correlated to the proper customer. And I think that's a big change from maybe how we were looking at modernization projects a few years ago, because I think the artificial intelligence side of that and the accuracy that we're now getting is just making it worthwhile to do. The other thing that I would say is bringing data lineage into this overall discussion of, you may have target systems that you want to migrate or shut down, but how well do we really understand the upstream and downstream systems that are attached to that particular application? With data lineage, we can go in at a code level and really understand what's feeding into and out of that application. And it ends up just making it a heck of a lot less disruptive as we start trying to migrate and shut things down. And it also really helps out on that prioritization up front of, hey, we were really looking at moving these systems first, but through a data lineage exercise, we're now seeing that these are much further integrated than we thought, where we have some other quick wins over here. The other thing, although it has been around for a while within Mobius and what we offer, I still don't see that a lot of organizations have taken advantage of this and maybe traditionally how they're handling documents and records, which is full text search capabilities. And as I'd mentioned, really moving away from those 3, 4, or 5 pieces of metadata to now being able to search across all the documents that are within a record, and having that available. I mean, I've sat down with end users, and if they're working on something that it's only something that was created today that they're reviewing, that's one thing. But when you need to start combing through historical information, or you're looking for line item details of either something that's out of balance or particular customer information, it can be a needle in a haystack if you don't have full text search capabilities. We've seen great results with that, and that really play back into better customer service and better response times as well. And Dan, I know as we start thinking about Ephesoft and digitization on some of our next questions, that idea of full text search capabilities and being able to have all that information in the document accurately identified is something that we'll get into with you as well. Didn't know if you had a comment now or just wanted to add in later, but I'll pitch that over to you.
No, I mean, I'll cover a little bit of that on the next slides, but I mean, getting the right data at the right time to use it with all these other tools that you guys are employing, whether that's Zia or ASG, is super important. And it's a major focus from the rest of the globe at the moment.
Yeah, and with that, Dan, thanks. We'll change it over to our topic number 2 here on operational excellence, right? And this idea of augmenting, extending, streamlining what you're doing today, and really getting big results out of that, as well as delighting the end users. So with that, Dan, as you and I had talked about this, for the audience, talk about some of the telling signposts, with the work that you do with Ephesoft and digitization and projects that you guys take on. When you see an organization that you've worked with that's gone through a successful project, what are those kind of telling signs of somebody that's being very modern and successful and automated around paper and capture and digitization and workflow?
Yeah, so I think it kind of goes back to something that everybody's been looking at for a long time, right? Which is this digital transformation conversation. But for one reason or another, digital transformation kind of gets pushed aside for some other type of initiatives and things like that. With the onset of COVID, digital transformation got pushed right to the forefront, whether that was because of regulatory compliance that we see in healthcare. It was the increase in volumes because we had a severe drop in rate increase, right, for mortgages, or the fact that the state and the federal level, there's a mandate now that they have to be digital before 2022. All those things came into play, and now we're seeing those come to the forefront. But what makes those people successful is how they respond and who they work with, right? It's really about utilizing the best in breed technologies that are offered in the marketplace. So that's RPA, BPM, what we're now calling intelligent document processing, traditionally capture, ingestion, those kinds of things. And then, what Mobius is doing with federation and redaction and things like that, right? And whatever those best of breed technologies are, you need to really put them together in the best way possible. The only way to really put those things together in the best way possible is to employ partners that we have like ASG or Zia to really put all those pieces together. So I have this talk track that I always talk about cogs on a wheel, right? And we're just one cog, and a wheel has thousands of cogs on it, right? Or hundreds of cogs, and you never know which one to pick. If you go into the RPA space, there's 12 of them, right? You go into OCR, it gets a little confusing. Who do you pick? Why do you pick them? And then you really need to get into what they're doing from an innovation perspective. And we'll talk a little bit about, Ephesoft in future slides, but innovation is really the key of what we're doing. And we're really being proactive in our approach when it comes to RPA integrations and what, Ryan was mentioning before, machine learning, natural language processing, all those things are on the roadmap. They're being actively worked, but they're not easy things to tackle, right? They may mean different things to different people. So we are seeing a lot of that. And the most successful people are really the people that embrace the fact that this is not an easy task and that they need to partner with somebody that they can trust and that can put all the pieces together to give you the right tools for the job that you're trying to specifically attack, right? Something for mortgage is definitely different than something for healthcare, or what they call patient information management now. And same thing with state and local governments, right? So that's really where we're seeing a lot of the success.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. Yeah, and we'll get a little further into some of the innovation points specific to Ephesoft, but I also agree, and I think it really, highlights the three of us coming together on this call, right? Of that idea of an end-to-end solution that's really covering this need for intelligent document capture through to the workflow and RPA components, and where AI and ML can fit in around that as well. The next question I have, Ryan, I'd like to pose for you, which is a number one obstacle that you see on that path to operational excellence for organizations that you work with, with their documents and records.
Sure. I have two number one obstacles as well. I'll do
We'll
that.
take it.
Sure. User engagement. I think, looking specifically at, the topic around documents and records, user engagement is always top of mind for us, right? Making sure that we, phrasing I use, right? Work the way you work, have customers that actually will continue to do their jobs in an effective manner without disrupting them as we think about helping them achieve that goal of operational excellence. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress around governance and records, I think, in a few minutes, but that's a big one, Greg. Another that comes to mind is skill set, honestly, right? And this is a little bit diverging from the question, but I think relevant to the overall flow here, which is, be honest with yourself organizationally. How ready are you? For example, we worked with a financial institution, Greg, your team and mine, over a couple of years, and it became obvious to us over the course of engaging them that they didn't know what they didn't know, and they were really good about acknowledging that, and they recognized they didn't have the skill to even make that determination. And so we ended up characterizing our work as a readiness assessment, and helping them determine how they could be ready to modernize. And in their case, it was a cloud deployment dialogue, and helping both internally with what they already have, but also with where they may be going, their ability to get there. Do they have people who are capable of managing an AWS infrastructure, for example, or Azure, or your cloud provider of choice, is a big one. And so one of the things that's particularly interesting about that conversation is there are options today where there may not have been in years past, right? Simply looking at things like a managed service approach or a software as a service approach where applicable. So those are things that, 4 or 5 years ago weren't always available, or not easily. So once again, I encourage, implore our prospective clients and customers to really be frank with themselves about what they can do, what their day job is, if you will, and what their appetite or ability is to do something different. And sometimes those don't align with business need, and of course that's when we get a chance to get involved. But that doesn't mean you can't achieve the goal. It means you just need to think carefully about how you get there and prepare yourselves for the inevitable differences from what you're doing today and what you would be doing tomorrow. So 2 different answers there to the number one obstacle, but I thought both pretty relevant.
Yeah, and to kind of chime in there, Greg, if I could,
Dan, hop on in.
that obstacle that we're seeing on our side most of the time, and I don't know if Ryan, you're seeing this, but now where we're getting to because of AWS or Google Vision or any of these other things that are being offered is this build versus buy, right? And when you're talking about operational excellence, to Ryan's point, do you have the mindset or the know-how to build out a true capture solution that's best in breed to really satisfy what your internal customers asking for, right? So I would say that that's probably the biggest one when it comes to ingesting the data nowadays is confusion, right?
It's a good one. I like these topics too, because we all come at them from a bit of a different angle. My thought goes to a number of CIO summits I've been involved with over the last 6 months. And I think as we think about COVID and we think about transformation, it's been really interesting to see those CIO paths of really connecting the business to the technical side of the house, right? And for years, you kind of hear, well, IT works for business, but I really have seen that come more and more to fruition of getting the business folks and the IT folks on the same side of the table and really understanding what that is. And Ryan, to your point, I do think that there are certain technological advancements that make those conversations a lot more fun and make it a lot easier for the IT folks, and the business folks get what they want at the end of the day. But I think about it from a Mobius Content Services perspective, where we've now released an automation platform called Zenith that we've fully integrated back into our Mobius platform. And it's bringing things like workflow and BPM and RPA to the table within this overall platform. But what it's also done, and Ryan, this kind of goes to one of the points that you brought up, is there's a visual editor for not only creating the workflow and BPM processes, but also to create that user experience for search and retrieval. And what we're seeing is organizations that traditionally may have said, hey, here's an interface that I guess will work for these 20 or 30 internal departments, are now saying, hey, this is really easy for me to whip up 20 or 30 individual UIs that really bring a lot more operational excellence for these teams, that they can intuitively sit down, find the information that they're looking for. And then also by having RPA capabilities, federation capabilities, we're also bringing more data to every one of those touch points. But when you sit down with an individual, sure, it might have been a workflow process before, but they're opening up the document within workflow, and then they're logging into 3 other systems to compare it against other information, right? So tying that all together and just making it feel like a much more cohesive experience, I think has really been key there as well on operational excellence and helping those conversations with the business folks and the IT folks just get a little bit better aligned and make sure that we're not just driving home an automation project, but what we're driving home is, here are 5 or 10 great ways that we can help out the business side of the house through this, right? Really putting a little bit more polish on that finished solution. With that in mind, I did have another spotlight here. This is for a leading dental and vision benefits administrator. And this falls right in line with where they would have claims that were coming in. Knowledge workers would be taking claims and information and putting them out on a shared drive so that they had access to them. They would then be trying to work these claims through a Windward claim system by opening up the document, searching on the shared drives, looking within Windward claims, terms and conditions, and around the policies that these individuals have would then be maintained out on SharePoint, because those were collaborative documents that were finalized. And then there was also information that was being maintained within Mobius as well. So kind of a many-headed process, if you will. And the goal of this project was, let's go ahead and digitize and OCR these documents up front, get them into Mobius immediately rather than out on shared drives. And then from there, let's integrate with Windward, that when documents come in and they arrive, there's intelligence to recognize that this is a new claim or an existing claim. Let's attach these documents to Windward claims via a link, so that as end users are in Windward claims doing their work, they click a link, they have access to documents residing in Mobius. They also have access to documents residing in SharePoint that could impact the claim. And then what I really liked about this project as well is, if you go to the right and you look at the cloud side of this, it was also that integration back into the Salesforce portal that agents and members are accessing. So now you have real-time information on the claim, plus all of the documents that have been received around the claim, plus the policy information. And being able to handle this through Salesforce, that it feels like all of these documents and information are sitting in one system behind the scenes. And Mobius Federation Services really being that piping between these multiple systems here. And what we end up seeing is a substantial, much faster turnaround time on claims, upwards of 40% gains and being able to close out the claims, much faster response time to requests that are coming in from agents and members around this. And then also, by getting the documents moved into Mobius early in the process, we're not only centralizing the documents, but we're securing those documents with encryption at rest, with redaction capabilities, and so forth. So a really great project and a good win here that I think, Dan and Ryan, it takes a number of those components that we've talked about in operational excellence and kind of brings it together here particular use case. And obviously, this is very similar for other industries as well. I think this example for, dental and vision claims is something that we can relate to at a high level, and many processes would be involved in and around here. And with that, I'll turn our attention over to our third topic, which is around automating information governance. And there's a lot of ways to think about compliance and regulations that are out there, and to think about governance. And we work with across pretty much all of the major industries. These are a number, I guess, of kind of key focal points that we see, right? Starting on the bottom left here, just what happens after a network breach, right? We've been talking disparate and fragmented systems, but do these systems have encryption at rest capabilities, right? Are those documents exposed within these systems? If you have workflow solutions today, are those documents encrypted as they're going through a workflow process, right? Are they redacted through those processes as well? When we think about dark data, I'm specifically thinking about sensitive information in this regard that, are residing in documents and records. A lot of the work we've done recently are around shared drives, Microsoft with SharePoint, Teams, and 365, and Box as well. And just thinking about how much sensitive information are within those documents, that when it's more of a collaborative end user run kind of scenario, a lot of times that sensitive information isn't recognized up front. So how do we recognize that? And then how do we actually take action around that? Policies and adherence, everything from just retention policies through to legal hold processes, and thinking about access controls as well, which a few years ago, access controls felt like, am I tracking who's viewing these documents into who can view it redacted? And now looking at this even from a time and geo-based tagging perspective, for things that are happening outside of particular borders, and how we better manage that. So that's a bit of an overview. I just wanted to set the stage here initially, Ryan, before we start digging into a few of these questions. So the first question that we have is, key insights for improving and automating information governance as we think about these topics. And in my mind, when I think about improving, one thing that comes up frequently is just flexibility of classification, right? If we're putting information within a system like Mobius, and we're also looking at this in a larger consolidation effort, having flexible classifications that make it easier to create larger profiles for identifying and pulling documents into the system, so that we don't end up with an administrative task that's like, oh gosh, we've got to create 1,000 or 10,000 different policies, right? And I think what we've really designed within our systems is a way to have less of these, classifications or buckets, if you will, but still being able to apply proper retention and redaction throughout the process around that. I think also the idea of improvements of just being able to connect these disparate systems, and as I'd mentioned, identifying sensitive information and then being able to take action on it, which we'll get a little further into. The other thing I find really interesting when it comes to information governance and words like automation is, sure, there's an opportunity to go in and automatically update retention periods or legal holds, but I also find that many organizations and their records management teams want to have a human element in part of this. It may not be for every decision being made, but they at least want to get in there and take a look at these documents, review the information, and make sure that they're being applied properly. So I think having automation is key, but also mixing that automation in with a manual workflow approval process where it makes sense for those organizations is huge. And I would say, when I think about automation for the folks that we have on the line, I would recommend within your own organizations really taking a look in two key areas. One is over retention. And for those of you that are joining us today, that are within highly regulated industries, many times that customer information that's being maintained needs to be maintained in unalterable storage, right? So digging into how well you're really addressing event-based retention for those types of documents on unalterable storage. And a lot of times what we see here is that, a customer opens an account, there's a lot of documents that go along with that particular account being opened. you can't really apply a retention schedule at that time. It's not until that account is actually closed down that that occurs, right? So the idea of trying to apply event-based retention into unalterable storage can be interesting. It's something that we've worked through internally with a number of our clients, but I also see a lot of organizations that really struggle on that path of over retention. The other one I'd say is a legal hold process. You know, if you look at your top 2 systems that maintain customer information, go dig into the legal hold process. So if there is a lawsuit or an internal or an external request to stop the retention process and not delete files when they actually get to their deletion dates, what does that look like? And many organizations, even if they're handling over retention, still run into issues with that legal hold process, where it's a manual process involving a lot of folks and shared drives as well. So those are a few things that I'd say take a look at, and things where we've really been able to help out organizations. And with that, Ryan, I'll see if you had anything from a key insights perspective for improving an automation you might want to bring up there.
I think my answers are going to align more with our second question here, so I don't want to steal all my own thunder, but I would tell you that I'll start with one. We've seen a scenario here, and I'm thinking of a very specific deployment we did a short number of years ago, where the customer had, not necessarily intentionally, but just the nature of their deployment, had put up a wall between their data and their business users by way of IT. So specific business users could go through their applications and get to their data, their information appropriately, and that worked fine. This is an insurance company, so they could process their claims and underwrite their policies and so forth. Other areas of the business that were also participants or users of that information did not have the same access. And our project had nothing to do with that. We ended up doing a project to help automate and make more robust the claims process, not dissimilar from what you described a couple of minutes ago, very similar use case. And what we found after the fact was the legal team was a raving fan, and we inadvertently, but purposefully, so we made the choice purposely, we just didn't realize that the value would be there. We inadvertently made the information appropriately available to the legal team. So you were talking, Greg, a minute ago about how you might handle legal holds and dealing with that discovery concept, as you imagine an insurance company has to deal with every day. And they had a significant gain in productivity simply by effectively automating the ability to get to that information for the right users, and taking IT out of that equation. So to the first question, little things like that, right? Look at where you're maybe there's unintended inefficiency, things along those lines that can be addressed as you think about a modernization initiative is important. Greg, given time, I'll just segue here to question number 2 as well. So how does successful information governance bridge the gap between end users and records managers? Funny enough, Zia kind of, I'll claim it, I think we coined the phrase not that many years ago. As we look at technologies like Mobius, your users can all effectively become records managers, right? You're a records manager and you don't even know it. Now that's a little silly. And quite honestly, we've never met a business user who purposely determined that the document that they were looking at was a record. Really, that's a highly unusual activity. And if they did make that determination, they did it begrudgingly, right? People don't like to do that. But if you can look at automation in that regard, right? The automatic filing into a filing plan where the documents are retained per corporate standards and as mandated by the business or regulatory reasons, is a very simple thing that your end users won't need to be aware of, but by policy and by use pattern, could effectively be taking a governance or a records management step as an end user as they interact with content. So that there's a specific, simple example. Our guidance would be from Zia's standpoint, right? Look at scenarios like that where, and I said it earlier, right? Enable end users to work the way they work, and take advantage of what they're doing from an automation standpoint, to participate in your governance strategy. And of course, sometimes that means you need to make changes to what they're doing, but do it mindfully with the way that they actually perform their business on a daily basis in mind. And that answers my question for number 2.
Excellent, thank you. This is just a quick snapshot slide that lays out some of what we've talked about here with from left to right, identifying documents, records, and information that could include sensitive information, being able to identify that through Ephesoft and intelligent document processing, as well as being able to classify, review, and correlate that. And then from an information governance side, at this point, do we leave those records where they are? Do we migrate them to something like a Mobius content platform for these governance services that are available? And also, if we're looking at destroying those records, let's have a disposition approval process available that we can go through there as well. So I'll just flash this up for a moment here, but I think it does start visually to construct some of the conversations that we've been having here on governance. And with that, we'll wrap with just a brief overview of each company. So Dan, I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Greg. So a brief overview of Ephesoft. We were founded in about 2010, and from Ike Kovis. And what happened was it was really a lack of innovation from his previous employer, where he came up with an better approach to classification and extraction, with the mission to really provide high value information from high volume documents to really optimize these processes, with the forward thinking, knowing that some of these processes were already happening. We were calling it BPM back in the day before it became RPA and all those other things. From there, we've continued to innovate. So we've released multiple different kinds of products for ingestion of, information off of IDs or any number of things. From there, that led us to having tons of partners. I mean, you see 250, I think that grows every month. And we do that so that we can have people like Zia and ASG in the back of the product giving us good suggestions, right? We have a customer advisory board, we have a partner advisory council, and we have all those things, and that just helps make our product better, right? And it's all about time to value and speed. I want to keep it high level. I know we only have 5 minutes, but if you have more questions around that, I'm happy to answer anything you got.
No, sounds great. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. With that, Ryan, let's do a quick intro on Zia Consulting.
Certainly. Zia is what I would call a traditional systems integrator and value-added reseller. So we imagine ourselves to be solution crafters, right? Listen for business challenge, bring best of breed solutions, taking advantage of technologies to address those challenges, right? So both our friends here at ASG and at Ephesoft are partners. They have platform technologies and often are paired together to solve business problems, specific to customer needs, and we use several examples throughout the day. So we do that quite well. We've been around for almost 2 decades at this point, and would just simply add that in addition to all of that, we're creating some of this intellectual property that builds some of the use cases that we characterize today. So the slide Greg showed a couple minutes ago with kind of the end-to-end picture has some of the pieces that we've built to collaborate. We've done some of the similar things with our friends at Ephesoft as well, and would be excited to speak about that with you as it made sense to your business.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ryan. And then for ASG Technologies, founded in 81, which makes it officially the oldest startup that I've worked for, right? When I think about, Dan, to your point as well on innovations, for ASG, over 50% of our revenue is put back into research and development. We're run by 70% of the Fortune 500. We are known for leading products within the content services with our Mobius platform, as well as in the data intelligence space with our product that we call Data Intelligence, which really focuses around data lineage. And the whole idea here is really around information management, from capture and classification through to management and delivery and automation around those things that we do. So what I would offer here for the attendees that have joined us today is a complimentary consultation. We would start off with just a 30-minute discussion. The goal of this is really just a fresh look at your current modernization goals with some expert advice from folks within our team that live and breathe this every day. Discussion topics would be just your current state, active projects that you're focused on, any of the topics that we've discussed here today. Get into a little bit of some of the goals that you're looking at, what software and solutions that you have in place. and then make some, recommendations for next steps and charting a course forward. And the participants around this would be, your stakeholders or knowledge workers for that initial call, and some of our transformation experts. And I would just say on behalf of myself and Ryan and Dan that we really appreciate you spending time with us here today. Hope that you've enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to touching base with you and learning more about your organizations and what you do as well. And as we start to move on the flip side of everything that's happening with COVID here, we hope to see you in person in some of the events that we host around the country too.
Thanks so much, guys. Great information. That's all the time we have for today. Just a reminder to our attendees to be on the lookout for an email later today with the link to the recording, contact information, and additional resources. And I know there are some questions that just came in that we didn't get a chance to answer, so we will reach out to you directly. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.